Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya. I have here with me my friend Pierre Kory. Dr. Pierre Kory, thank you for joining me. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time and let people know your story. I know lots of people know your story, but to have the story told on the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Jay. It's nice to see you again. I first saw you in that Homeland Security, session with Senator Johnson. You testified, I think, before me, and I testified after you.
It really has. I mean, you made
quite the journey.
I didn't know about you before that session. It made a tremendous impression on me. But we'll get to that. I have an agenda, Pierre. So let's save that for later in the agenda. Okay, cool. But actually, why don't we just start with you introducing yourself? You're a pulmonologist and a CCU doctor, long time clinician, taking care of patients, critically ill patients. And at the beginning of the pandemic, you were at the University of Wisconsin, right?
Yep. Yeah. So just briefly, I triple boarded for now, knock on wood, in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, and critical care medicine. So I was really most known for my ICU expertise. The highlights of my career, I became a national expert in something called therapeutic hypothermia, which we treat patients after cardiac arrest. And then I taught for years pioneering a field called critical care ultrasonography, where I taught doctors how to use ultrasound to make life-saving diagnoses. And my textbook is in like 7 languages, second edition. And I went around the country teaching that skill, country and world, really. And then, like you said, when COVID hit, I'd been recruited about 5 years before. I was the chief of the critical care service at the University of Wisconsin, and I was the head of their main ICU, which was called
you were dead center of American medicine. You were contributing to the research on how to do critical care medicine. You were taking care of critically ill patients, and you were the head of a large group at a prominent medical center in the head of American academic medicine.
I mean, it is a massive academic medical center, and I was a very well-respected clinician and teacher. I really consider myself, my career as a master educator. I mean, I won departmental teaching awards at major, university academic centers. And so I love to teach, do research and teach and care for patients. And I was a little bit of a workaholic. I worked a lot and loved every minute, except for, having to, keep the family on the side a little too much. We always regret that.
Okay.
But,
so
that's where I was.
2020 comes and you find yourself in the front line. So I'm a researcher primarily. I don't care for patients. I do research. That's my full-time job, although I have an MD. But you're at the front line and critical care, pulmonology, that's really at the front line. COVID patients are coming in to the ICU, and you are what did you see then in the early days of the pandemic? What were your thoughts? What were your activities in the early days of that pandemic?
Oh boy, yeah. So first of all, when it started to come, when we started seeing that it was coming, again, the images from Lombardy and Wuhan, and then Seattle was coming closer and closer. Remember, I was in the middle of the country, and here it was. I see this pulmonary and critical care disease enveloping the world. And I'm at kind of the peak of my career. I was 50 years old, very well respected as a, kind of a hard-nosed clinician. And what was interesting is I trained, most of my career was in New York City. And so I either was trained with, or trained under like every head of the ICUs all over New York City. And so I was literally on the phone with them, finding out what they were seeing, what they were doing. The stories I was hearing was crazy. I mean, there was a disaster zone there. And then at the same time, we had no cases in Wisconsin for weeks after New York got hit. So we spent all of my time, we were rearranging schedules and backup plans for in case people got sick, because we were anticipating like huge numbers of the workforce having to be out sick. And so you needed all these backups, and it was a frenetic plan. We were changing like formations of ICU rooms so we could bring like IV tubing and vent tubing like through some cabinets so that you didn't have to go in and out, because donning and doffing, as we called it back then, I haven't said that word in years, but donning and doffing was like just crazy. The way we took off our gowns and the gloves and you'd put them on and and the shields, and you're like, I sweat easily. And so I'm enclosed in these gowns trying to see patients. And it was just this frenetic period. And actually I did write about it in my book. At the time I had a young child who was very, very ill at home. And my ex-wife, who was also a pulmonary and critical care specialist, she was on leave taking care of our child. And so she was really scared of me bringing home COVID because I was going to the hospital every day, and the child was immunosuppressed at the time. And so it was a really very kind of traumatic, dynamic, kind of overwhelming
I
experience.
would get emails from people who's, they write like my husband works in the ICU or ER or something, and can I hug him when he comes home? Like emails like that I was getting from people when I started talking about COVID. People, because people were just hungry for information, and that sense of panic. It came to the West Coast also. A lot of my colleagues were also talking to their New York colleagues and panicking. But there were very, very few cases early on. There were big convention centers transformed to makeshift hospitals. The Santa Clara County Convention Center that actually saw almost no patients, I think, but they were very worried about the overflow. The New York experience is so interesting, right? So, and you write about this a little bit in your book about the kinds of protocols that they adopted early. And why don't we take? I just wanted to focus on a couple of them. Why don't we start with the use of mechanical ventilation? The literature, as best I understand it, suggests that was a tremendous mistake. That we ended up probably harming people from using that early aggressive mechanical ventilation protocol, where people with sort of normal, just pulse oxes that were in the range that they probably you wouldn't put on a protocol before the pandemic. You put them on the protocol, or you keep them on longer than they should. And something like 90% of people who went on mechanical ventilation never came off. And yet at the time, it was seen as like the main thing that we were short. Right? You had Elon Musk jumping in saying, "I'm going to turn Tesla into a ventilator factory" or something. I mean, there was going to be military requisitioning of ventilators, huge focus on getting enough ventilators for everybody. Can you describe what happened there? Like, how did you go? How did that protocol get in place? And then what happened to it?
Yes. So it's a really complicated topic because mechanical ventilation is a big piece, but I would say the lack of treatment is very hard to separate those two because so what happened was I was in Wisconsin, and yes, those ventilator fears of running out and not having enough people talking about the ethical quandaries that might develop if you can't offer someone a ventilator. And I was considered a mechanical ventilation expert. And so I was on the phone with like the procurement officer for the state of Wisconsin. And he was sending, because the ventilator market was going crazy back then. And they were literally looking at all these surpluses that were coming out of warehouses. So me and the head of respiratory were like looking at the different features of each ventilator and making suggestions like, yes, this will do, get these. Anyway, but here's really the breakdown of what I saw. So what happened is in Wisconsin, we started getting patients early April, and they started to trickle in at the University of Wisconsin. And I was in charge of about 17 intensivists, critical care specialists on my service. And we were having daily briefings every single day. And after the first few patients, there was a difficult intubation on the floor one night where the patient was really, really hypoxic, really short of breath. And, it was kind of, I think, freaked everyone out. And so some colleagues came up to me and said, hey, we really should have a trigger for intubation. Now, the traditional trigger for intubation is really complex in and of itself. You should only put someone on a mechanical ventilator if they have excessive work of breathing, meaning their work of breathing is such that you make the determination that they cannot sustain that without mechanical support. So that's traditional. Now, determining when that point is insanely difficult. In my whole career, I've always second guessed every time I put someone on a ventilator. Like, did I do it too early? The only times I was sure what I did wrong was when I did it too late. Like after I'd intubate someone, I'm like, yeah, I don't know why I held off for so long because they were never going to avoid the ventilator. But here now there is this propensity to do it early. And there's a few things driving that. So one was fear of the trajectory and pattern of disease. Because what makes an expert is pattern recognition. And there's so many different types of respiratory or causes of acute respiratory failure. For instance, pulmonary edema and pneumonia act very differently. Asthma acts very differently. COVID was this novel kind of thing. And the pattern of respiratory failure was odd. Like people actually didn't need ventilators for days and days and days. They'd just be on high flow oxygen and they were breathing relatively comfortably. But yeah, you saw people getting so scared and they were getting used to these patterns of getting worse, that they were on average putting people on too early. And some centers were having just oxygen triggers, which is a no-no. Like what was proposed to me at Wisconsin was like, people were saying 6 liters of nasal cannula, Once they're above that, then we should intubate them. And I argued right off the bat, because I'm an expert. I used to give lectures on timing of intubation. And I said to the team, I said, no way. We're not changing how we use mechanical ventilation. This was in University of Wisconsin. And I got to tell you, everyone stood down in that call. And they agreed that we were not going to institute, an oxygen trigger. Now, does that mean that they weren't intubating early on the floor? Like, I'm not everywhere in that hospital at all times of day and night, and we're different clinicians still having a psychological, and they probably were, and that was probably occurring everywhere. And I do know some institutions had triggers, and certainly that contributed, Jay, but it was the lack of treatment. There were so many centers. Like, I'll give the perfect example, and this is why I resigned from the University of Wisconsin, is because at those briefings, I was also saying, guys, they're so inflamed. The lungs are showing a pattern of what's called organizing pneumonia, which the primary treatment for is corticosteroids. We were seeing clotting like we'd never seen before. I'm looking at dialysis circuits where it's tubing, and you can see the clots in the tubing. And so blood thinners was like a no-brainer, but like my heads, the people above me were saying, this is dangerous. You don't know what the outcomes are. You could hurt someone. There's no randomized control trial to support this.
The ID folks were, their inclination is this is a viral disease. You don't want to suppress the immune function. Steroids suppress the immune function. Don't do it, right? So that was the reasoning. But then what I also heard from critical care folks very early on is exactly what you said, that look, there's this sort of hyperreaction that's actually is the major problem that's causing the deaths. It's not really a viral condition later in the disease. It's something else. Yes. And steroids are necessary. And it was very clinical.
And but yeah, that was like such a stark divide. What you just articulated, you're exactly right. Those ID doctors, they've always been cautious around steroids because there are a couple of infections that if you put people on steroids, you can make them worse, like strongyloidiasis, which is like a worm. But in general, steroids given late in the phase of a disease are not harmful. In fact, they're life-saving. The one thing you want to avoid with steroids is not too early. So in a viral syndrome, you don't want to give them the first few days. But here's the thing. Umberto Meduri, my colleague, co-founder of the FLCCC, he's literally the world expert on the use of corticosteroids in lung disease. And him and his colleagues had done a deep dive on all the SARS and MERS and H1N1 data. And it showed as long as you didn't give it in the first few days, it was absolutely life-saving. And so there was these butting heads all over the country. And because it was primarily an infectious disease, guess who ruled the roost? Generally, the infectious disease doctors, they were the ones telling the protocols. And me as a clinician I throw steroids at everything in the ICU. That's overstatement, but we're very aggressive with steroids because we know how potent it is. And it led to arguments everywhere. But, over time, things shifted and people started to understand what kind of disease this was. I will tell you the ventilation thing was like almost night and day. You go fast forward 6 months, doctors all around the country realized that these patients did not need ventilators. They just needed oxygen support or sometimes non-invasive ventilators. So care practices changed. But in the beginning, again, this is not trying to place too much blame. It was a lot of fear, ignorance, lack of expertise, and again, a lot of different viewpoints. And so, good care, which was born of clinical experience, was not what was being practiced.
I have a question. This has always been a curiosity to me. To what extent did fear of the doctors themselves getting exposed to COVID play in the institution of mechanical ventilation decisions? Was that part of some people's thinking?
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's not a pleasant one, right? Because that brings up real ethical situation. Now, I would say it wasn't overt, but what contributed to that is there's a little piece you're missing. So there's this device called a high-flow nasal cannula. It's actually called heated high-flow nasal cannula, or HHFNC. And it's this incredible device which can deliver really high rates of oxygen to the nose, which is 100% humidified and heated. And so you can support patients with those things who have incredible oxygen requirements. And you can see their work of breathing settle down. They can also talk, eat, drink. They can move around the room a little bit. And so they're actually almost miraculous devices. What was happening early on, because I was involved in a lot of these meetings and discussions, is that a lot of people were saying we shouldn't use those things because, it's going to jet the virus around the room and it's going to make everything more infectious and it's going to hurt the staff. And so they were against using it. And I felt like that, just from a logical, commonsensical approach, I felt like let's say even theoretically they were true, in a clinical sense, it was not going to make a significant difference. And I really was against this kind of disallowing of those nasal cannulas. So I would say early on, without that intermediate step of offering someone a heated high flow nasal cannula, you were seeing patients proceed to ventilation, and that was being driven by fear of increasing infection risk to staff. But I will tell you, it didn't, when I say didn't last long, I don't know how to define long, but when I got to New York in late April to do a month there as an emergency volunteer, when I walked into that hospital, I mean, heated high flow nasal cannulas were the workhorse of that whole hospital. I mean, everybody was on a heated high flow nasal cannula. Now, remember, they got hit earlier, so their clinical experience and what they could do changed. So, that was New York. It was at the forefront.
You brought something up which I think is really important. It's very easy to say to give blame to people for making those decisions early on in panic and in ignorance. But of course, doctors were confronting something that's brand new to them. Of course, there's going to be mistakes, and it's understandable. And in a sense, as I said, I was getting emails from people, the spouses of doctors, scared of being exposed because their husband or wife or something was caring for patients in the front line.
Jay, I'm sorry. I have to admit, we were wiping down groceries. I was coming home from work, stripping down naked in the garage, putting everything into a bag and putting on some scrubs.
There's nothing wrong with that. That's why I think I really have advocated being forgiving of that, especially in that panic period. That made sense. And so I don't mean to bring these questions up because I want to indict people. I bring these questions up because it's important to understand what happened.
No. I think you're being very fair, and I try to be fair too, because although I disagreed, and although in hindsight I was correct, I think we were all trying to do our best. No one had the patient's worst interest at heart.
Right. I view the folks who were at the front line as heroes for that. They were going and thinking that they were getting exposed to something that was going to kill them, because they were looking at what was happening in Italy, in Wuhan.
Yep. I want to bring up a little anecdote because. So when I was in New York, every night at 7 p.m., every cop, fire engine, cab, Uber, they horns, sirens, honking, people came out of their windows cheering. This is 7 o'clock every night for all the frontline workers, because they were so appreciative that we were working our butts off in these hospitals that were overrun. And I just remember that because it was you don't see that kind of like community kind of bonding and this, this support and this positive energy. And it was quite moving every night. I think for some, it probably quickly got annoying because they did it for a while, but not to get dark so early,
no,
Jay,
but
we're
going to get there. Let's back just a tiny bit. Okay, so let's go back to steroids and in particular dexamethasone, because you mentioned something which I think is really also maybe a source of a little bit of disagreement between you and me that's worth exploring. So very early on, there's this conflict between ID doctors and critical care doctors, and critical care doctors, of course, turned out to be right. There was a little bit of a fight over whether you could run a randomized trial in this setting, and I think maybe you're a little bit more on the side of we should be careful about randomized trials in this setting, these kinds of settings. I'm a little bit more on the side of less we should run them, but there actually was a randomized trial run in the UK with dexamethasone, a steroid, right? And it was a positive trial where and it was run very early on. I was actually quite impressed. I was like April, May, I forget exactly, 2020. And it came back with the result that dexamethasone saved lives in the ICU. And I think it had a pretty big impact on clearing up that debate.
Well, so I think we're both right. And I'll tell you why. I agree with you that in modern medicine, and I would say in the modern perversion of evidence-based medicine, because I think evidence-based medicine has lost its moorings with this hegemony of the randomized control. Yeah, and I agree with you. I think your statement is correct. In order to establish the standard of care, you needed a randomized controlled trial, okay? But on my side, I believe there was overwhelming and sufficient evidence to make it the standard of care based on numerous large retrospective observational trials of prior viral pandemics. Also, my first paper I wrote, which is that the form of respiratory failure that SARS-CoV-2 was causing was something called an organizing pneumonia. Now, an organizing pneumonia is not an infection. It's associated with infections, but it's this pattern of lung injury that's often triggered by either drugs, some infections, different toxic exposures, but is a very characteristic pattern on CT. And I wrote a paper showing that what we're looking at is organizing pneumonia. In almost all cases, it was this organizing pneumonia response to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we've known for decades that the predominant treatment of organizing pneumonia is corticosteroids. So I could argue 3 ways from Sunday that should be the standard of care, but those kind of arguments, Jay, are going to fall on deaf ears. People want their randomized controlled trial. And it's not just, it's not that you're like that, but the system is now built like that.
This is a perennial thing. It's a perennial thing, right? This is not like a new thing, right? So and let's just take a step back and say, okay, you have a new disease. Of course, you're going to use analogies to other diseases that are similar to decide what the treatments are to start. And of course, it's going to be doctors who are caring for the patients at the front line, doctors who have a lot of clinical experience. They're going to start to have ideas about how to do it. That is exactly what you want to have happen. You want to empower those doctors like you at the front line who are seeing patients and saying, "Okay, my clinical experience leads me in this direction." I think I do still, although I agree with you that evidence-based medicine has become really corrupted in many ways, I still very strongly am a proponent of resolving clinical disputes with randomized studies. I think that's a very important tool we have, and we should get rid of it very, reluctantly. I think what you have is this.
Can I push back on that? Can I push back on that for a second? So, are you familiar with the Cochrane review written by a guy named Engelmeyer in 2016, where they looked at the decades of disease models, interventions, therapeutics, in which there were randomized controlled trials and retrospective observational controlled trials. And they tried to see if there was a difference in what they found. And you know what they found is, on average, in almost very rare circumstances, did they lead to 2 different results. And so it kind of really weakens this idea that you need in clinical medicine. I'm not talking about in the laboratory or, in animal models. There you need very, I think, controlled trials. But clinical medicine is very different. Once you have someone who's ill at different phases of illness, different comorbidities, randomized controlled trials have flaws, but they generally lead to the same result. Now, what they also wrote in that paper is when the results differ, you need to find out why. And you have to look at other things besides study design. Because there are famous examples of randomized controlled trials finding one thing and observation controlled trials finding another thing. And everybody chooses the randomized controlled trial. But I have multiple examples where the randomized controlled trial was not the correct choice. But observation controlled trials are always dismissed as unmeasured confounders and all these other things. I think those risks are overstated. And so it's funny
because I spent my career writing observational studies. I mean, that's most of my published papers are observational.
Epidemiology, that's what you guys do.
I find it funny to being on the defensive about observational studies, because I agree with you about their value pretty fundamentally, just based on what I've done with my own career. I think but I actually think that tension is really healthy. So you could have a randomized trial in population A, and it convinces people in population B to take it where it doesn't work. And so the randomized trial itself causes harm by empowering people in a different population in whom the intervention doesn't work to adopt the intervention. That's a classic problem, right? Observational studies play.
But wait, hold on. There's also the converse, Jay. The converse is also true. And let me say one thing, because you're an epidemiologist and not an intensivist. There has been really interesting papers written in big ICU journals where some really leading lights in critical care medicine have actually publicly called for the end of randomized controlled trials in the ICU. And the reason why is there's literally only been 2 or 3 positive RCTs. They're generally negative. And they're negative on things that we know work. So it's the opposite than your example, is that they'll do these randomized controlled trials and they'll conclude that this thing doesn't work, but you can find why it doesn't work. The disease processes are too heterogeneous. You'd have to look at subgroups or they're using it too late or too low a dose, like the typical things that in clinical medicine. So it gets messy. I don't think there's one clear way out of it, but let me put up one more thing. When I was against randomized controlled trials, you have to remember to run a trial where you're going to randomize someone to a placebo, whoever's running that trial has to have something called clinical equipoise, meaning that they truly in their head do not know whether therapy is going to be more beneficial or more risky. So they have to really be agnostic in order to put someone into a placebo. Because if you know that the treatment it works and is better than placebo, how could you assign someone a placebo? You're basically, committing them to harm. And so for me, based on all of my knowledge, experience, and all of this other data, to me, it was like a no-brainer. Corticosteroids are needed. And remember that session in the Senate, I put out a fiery call. There's a critical need for corticosteroids in the hospital. And I did it before the randomized control trial. And then that Oxford study was 2 months later. And then it became standard of care. So you are correct. You needed that to make standard of care. But I don't know. I have too many strong clinical opinions. And I couldn't, I was like, please, these people are dying. And there's another thing too, Jay. This is more of as a clinician, but the pattern in which I saw patients landing on ventilators, and when they would land on there and they weren't moving, they weren't getting better, and their lungs were getting slowly and slowly destroyed. And it was so clear to me that it was lack of treatment. They were literally dying of this supportive care only approach because no one knew what to do. And so I think I was too close for me to to have like this dispassionate kind of scientific view. And so I think I got a little over.
That's part of your charm, Pierre.
I don't know. It's very hard. I was too close.
That's part of your charm, Pierre. So I don't know if you should apologize. But, okay. I mean, because I tend to the opposite sin. I tend to be bloodless sometimes when I probably should be more passionate. There's plenty to be passionate about, I think. Okay.
I like those two sides. And I think we both contribute. And this is what you said. It's a healthy debate and it's good tension, right? So let's move forward. And I want
to stay on that theme of early treatment and treatment protocols. So you found an organization called the FLCCC, and one of the main first things about it is this protocol. This with a very nice acronym, Math Plus Protocol. Describe first that protocol and then the reception in the clinical community to the protocol and also to the founding of the FLCCC.
Yeah. So I really have to credit Paul Marik, my partner, my colleague, my friend, because, although I was well known in the specialty, I mean, I was nothing compared to Paul Marik. I mean, he was at the time the most published practicing intensivist in the history of our specialty. He and I had become very close as colleagues and friends, maybe 3 years earlier in like 2017-18, because I discovered that his work on intravenous vitamin C in sepsis was absolutely just stunning. Like when he first published his paper, I ignored it because I thought it was crazy. I was like, oh, vitamins, we're on vitamins now. I just thought it was like, and the results were too eye-popping to believe. And even though it was a retrospective observation control trial, I didn't know at the time how valid they were. And so I dismissed it for about a year. And I write about this in the book. And then one day I was having a bad week in the ICU. I was having patients die of sepsis, kind of too many for that week. And this one family was like, is there anything else you can do for my what I think was a father? And I was like, well, there's this protocol, with the high dose IV vitamin C, IV thiamine, and hydrocortisone. And I tried it on the guy and he died. But I knew he was dying anyway. He was literally near death. And so I didn't make any opinion on the protocol, but I tried it again that week, once and twice. And then the third patient I tried it on, I saw something I hadn't seen in my whole career. I saw a patient who was literally rapidly hurtling to death. He was neutropenic with no white cells, a bone marrow transplant patient, no urine for 12 hours on high dose vasopressors with like marginal blood pressure. He was encephalopathic, confused, breathing fast. And I put him on this protocol. And by evening, he was settling down. When I came back in the morning, he was outside of his bed, sitting in a chair, eating scrambled eggs with his wife with a full bag of urine. Now, that's a story that only an intensivist can tell. But for an intensivist, that's like, I don't want to use too grandiose word, but I hadn't seen a resuscitation or a resurrection like that. So anyway, that's a little aside. But I reached out to Paul Marik because he had reached out to me, and then we connected, and I just became fast. I was obsessed with the therapy. I did studies on it. I was trying to, promote it as a protocol across the University of Wisconsin. And so Paul and I became good friends. So when COVID broke out, we were on the phone every day. What are you seeing? What are you seeing? And then other people came to Paul. This is how FLCCC started, because people knew how good Paul was at protocols and what a kind of a master of science he was and a clinician. And they told him, get a group of your colleagues together. Let's get together. Because remember, the government wasn't doing anything. They were saying, stay home until you turn blue. Now, this was a hospital protocol, admittedly, but they also weren't putting out a hospital protocol. They were just saying like supportive care only, like fluids, Tylenol, oxygen, ventilators. And so we started to get to work, and we hired like another nonprofit, gave us some money for like a website, and we started to put together the protocol, and we had a couple of people helping us, trying to talk to the press, trying to put out our protocols, knowledge of our protocols. The press would not talk to us. Come back to us when you have an RCT. They did not care of like decades of expertise and experience treating similar diseases, but it was called Math Plus, and it was methylprednisolone, which is a corticosteroid like dexamethasone. We have data showing it's actually superior to dexamethasone, but let's leave that aside. A is for ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, so high dose IV vitamin C. T is thiamine, which is a really important vitamin, which we also gave intravenously. And then H is for heparin, which is a blood thinner. So it was basically corticosteroids, antioxidants, and blood thinners. And it was a really potent combination. By the way, it's nothing close to what they were doing out there. They were doing nothing. I mean, some people were using
about the vitamin C and the thiamine. Like those are basically, in a sense, like you're not going to overdose on them. Like, what is the harm? So the downside, there is no downside. And so why would you not?
Nope. What I call system doctors now, these erudite academics, they will constantly say you're going to cause kidney stones with IV vitamin C, because high dose oral vitamin C has been associated with kidney stones. But in the decades of experience, in the many years, we have not seen kidney stones. So you're really literally true. There's no harm. Unless you want to talk about cost.
Even as
the
a
cost
kidney
of
stone,
not treating is far higher
the cost
than treating.
is a kidney stone, and you survive the ICUs. I mean, like, I'll take the.
Why are you making so much sense? Why are you making so much sense? Because that's not the logic that I see employed. Like literally, you can have a dying patient in multi-organ failure where you have evidence that they can sometimes come out of it with high dose IV vitamin C, and people say no. I mean, that doesn't.
So like, okay, so.
Hi everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of a general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it.
But you have this protocol, and you have a group of doctors, highly credentialed. Paul Marik, as you said, is like sort of the high priest of ICU docs. And in the research world and in the clinical world, and you have this, and you've formed this group, this FLCCC, and you have a protocol that you're recommending, but you're not allowed to talk about it by the press. It's instead what you have is another group of doctors, who run the boards or whatever, saying no, you're not allowed to do that.
Yep.
So, okay, let's just look at it, step back objectively, and say, look, you have two groups of doctors, both of whom have some expertise, some claimed expertise. As a layman, how do we select among the two? You would have to try to look at the experience of the doctors, the success of them. Instead, what happened was a direction to the press, but from somewhere, the head of the NIAID or wherever, saying the FLCC doctors are the bad guys. They're doing dangerous things. They should be suppressed and demolished and smeared and destroyed. Right? In fact, that's what I saw with the FLCC is like this sort of this sort of impugning of bad motives, this idea that somehow you're in it for the money, or just actually similar to the kinds of things that happened to me and others who spoke up against the lockdowns, like this sort of like marginalization, even though you were at the center before. What you really had was disputes among two groups of doctors. So let's just look at the data and the reasoning and the results and the outcomes, and we can argue of exactly the right methods to do that. But that's what should have happened: a real debate, a platforming of debate.
That debate would have been awesome to have. They weren't having them. But there's this other thing that how I see it is that, the system with this corporatization of medicine, these huge, hospital systems now, where now most doctors are employed, and there's these top-down approaches, like there's a system protocol, right? And so I was part of the therapeutics group at UW where we argued for different medicines. I managed to argue, putting forth enough evidence to put IV vitamin C on our protocol initially. It was later removed by the dean. That's a different story, but we were having debates and discussions, and we were coming up with protocols. But in a lot of other places, let me give you another anecdote, which is when I started to advocate for using other things like corticosteroids and heparin, one of my superiors at one of our daily briefings, they started to take over. I used to run the briefings, and I saw this slow encroachment because I don't think they liked my approach. My approach is a little bit more aggressive. I didn't care about having this randomized controlled trial there. I had really good clinical rationale and experience. And I remember this one day, it's really important. He goes, we need to follow the guidelines. And I'm looking around, I'm wait, this is
what guidelines? On what basis?
Mid-April. And I was hold on, let me tell you the guidelines, Jay. So because after I said, what guidelines? He said, the American Thoracic Society has put out a position paper. And I'm oh, I got to see this thing. I look at it, and this is what it was. It took 100 top academic intensivists from around the country, and it posed 6 clinical questions to them. Do you believe we should use corticosteroids in advanced respiratory failure? Should we use this or that? There's a number of other medicines and even anticoagulation. And of the 6 things, and I'm just going to briefly I might get a little bit off, but it was basically 40, 40, 20, meaning 40% said yes, 40% said no, 20% said undecided. This was the guidelines, which is that nobody really, either you wanted to use it or didn't want to use it, or you didn't know. And that's what I was supposed to follow. That was the guidance we had. And so it was.
That would have been 40, 40, 20. It cries out for debate. It cries out for a reasoned discussion. Okay, yes. So I want to hit on remdesivir, and this cuts into another theme that I wanted to talk about. Right. So the math protocol. One of the things that's obvious about it is every single drug on there is is generic and cheap, right? You don't have to. It costs basically zero to treat a patient with a math protocol. Then there's this very expensive new drug that had been used for Ebola with a really dodgy randomized trial behind it in April of 2020 that all of a sudden is adopted universally for treating patients with COVID, remdesivir. And there's all this evidence that it potentially has all these side effects, not just kidney stones. And so you have the rapid adoption of an expensive drug with pharma behind it, and essentially a marginalization of cheap drugs that were like dexamethasone, methylprednisone. There's good evidence from randomized studies that it works. Yet it's marginalized. When you talk about system doctors, it's hard to not look at the influence of pharma on the guidelines, on the system doctors, and the power that they have to marginalize voices that are pushing for relatively inexpensive, effective treatments.
That is implicit in my use of that word. Thank you for articulating it, because that is literally implicit. And by the way, I used to be a system doctor, except not really, because I was kind of free-thinking, freewheeling, innovative. I was always interested in seeing how we could do things better. I was always pushing I got to tell you, when I resigned, it was I actually felt, I got to tell you, I told my ex-wife this at the time because she was supportive, because I asked her, I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't be a leader, in this pandemic when they're doing this stuff. And when I left, I felt like I had left the cult. I literally felt like I'd left the cult, and that I could now go on to becoming the doctor I could. And New York was much less, my hospital back in New York at that time was much less restrictive, and they allowed me to do whatever. When I got there to New York, I was putting everyone on Math Plus protocol. The problem was I inherited a unit of really advanced near-death patients, and I couldn't save them. But you're right. That cried out for debate. The remdesivir story is, you just brought that. I mean, Jay, that is illustrative of the system that we live in, which is that, obscene profit-making medications are prioritized over anything else. And anything that threatens the market for that profit-making pharmaceutical product is derided, dismissed, distorted. That's one of the themes underlying my book, The War on Ivermectin. And there's a famous slide that I made, which I put on Twitter and I use in a lot of my lectures, which is I took there's this website called C19early.com where they did a real-time compilation of all clinical trials for all therapeutics. And those guys actually did the best science, hands down, in all of COVID. But because they're anonymous and not peer-reviewed, and it's kind of a real-time compilation like database, but it's a real-time meta-analysis. But when you see there's literally 43 different effective interventions for COVID, and then I would circle the ones that are approved in the U.S., and they also put the cost next to each one. Every $1, $5, $10, $20, no, even though it was showing the most potent, the only ones circled the ones where it was 500, 700, 3,000. And it's just a stark illustration that we live in a system controlled by pharma. They do run the journals, they run the agencies, certainly the FDA, the NIH, and the CDC. And so the results, I can't remember the phrase. Maybe you can help me, Jay, but there's a phrase that the results you get depends on how the system is structured. Every system structure, achieves the results it's designed to achieve, and nothing is more true than that. But remdesivir was one of the first and most scary examples. And the Ebola story is bad. I mean, the toxicity of Ebola, of its use in Ebola, was really bad. One of the reasons why we didn't like it was even aside from the fact that Fauci did a press conference from the White House Oval Office on a botched trial where they changed the endpoint in the middle, and it was a weak endpoint that they changed it to anyway. It was 2 days less of hospitalization. Beyond that, we had data showing that from day one of symptoms, you can actually culture the virus till about day 6 or 7, and then there's no more live virus. And basically, people were entering the hospital day 8 or 10 on average, just particularly in the first year. So why would you use toxic intravenous antiviral that's very expensive when they're not suffering from an invasive viral infection. It's all like hyperinflammation from we think it's the RNA fragments and the debris of the spike protein. And so it just made illogical, rational sense. And then the clinical data was just really weak. And the history of toxicity was horrible. And remember, the WHO did a trial and they didn't recommend it. So why in the United States of pharma it's being infused into every patient's arm, whereas a lot of the rest of the world, they're like, no, we're not going to use it. It's toxic and it doesn't work.
So now, but I want to let's move forward in time a little bit. So you resigned from the University of Wisconsin, and this is I forget exactly the date, but I think it was May 2020. There's the Senate testimony that you give. Maybe I'm mixing the timeline up, but I remember one of the things. Yeah,
no, it was the same one you were in, Jay. You were in the same session as me. It was May 6th,
my view then was we have a capacity, the NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, a tremendous amount of money, and we have uncertainty about how to manage the disease, understandable uncertainty. We need to run rapid studies that resolve the uncertainty. And I was absolutely appalled that we had not already, I was looking at the UK, seeing them run that randomized study for dexamethasone, which really impressed me that they did it so rapidly. And I thought, so that's what I thought I'd use my testimony to argue for. But what actually happened was the NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, they eventually organized these studies called the active studies, randomized studies of things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, like relatively inexpensive drugs, repurposed drugs. But the results come out 3 years later, long after it does any good.
Wait, hold on. Can I interrupt? Jay, I got to interrupt you on that because I want to correct the statement you just made. So yes, the U.S. response was to develop the Active 6 clinical trials. But hold on. Active 6 was the sixth round. It was actually called just Active. And because I have this one talk where I show this in a series of slides. Active 1, patented pricey pharmaceuticals. Active 2, patented pricey
it's only 6 where they get
keep going.
Cheap
3, 4, 5. It was only Active 6
3 years later.
3 years later, and because I think they saw the outcry
that
around
should
the world.
Outrage every single American.
Exactly.
Right? We have the capacity to run rapid. The whole purpose of the NIAID is the argument, the economic argument is that, look, the pharma has no interest running studies on these cheap repurposed drugs. It's really important, potentially really important data. There's a public interest in running. That's why we fund organizations like the NIAID. That's why they're taxpayer funded. They're literally, their main job is to run the studies that pharma would not run. And yet they delay for years, long after it's going to be any use whatsoever to managing patients at the height of the pandemic, the results of the study. It is. I mean, so that was the thing that was motivated me in that. But we but I want to focus on your testimony as I remember it, and you can correct me if I'm misremembering it. But it was so striking to hear because I hadn't known about you before, but you came and talked about ivermectin, unless I'm mixing up time.
No, wait, hold on. May was corticosteroids, which I think we've already covered.
September.
Ivermectin was December of 2020.
Yeah, so let's head to that one
because
I think that's a really important. That's a really important sort of watershed moment, right? Because now we're moving from talking about how do you manage patients in the hospital to how do you prevent people getting in the hospital to begin with. In that whole summer, there had been this huge fight over hydroxychloroquine, and it was poisoned by President Trump saying, "Oh, it works." And then everyone on Earth saying, "Oh, he's President Trump. How could he be right about anything? He's obviously wrong." And I remember my reaction to that was I didn't know if it worked. In the absence of studies that I believed. But I also remember when I was a medical student, I worked in India for several months, and I was on hydroxychloroquine. I mean, it was as an agent to prevent malaria. Right. And so I thought, okay, if they are recommending medical students take it, as prophylaxis. And I also knew that rheumatoid arthritis patients took hydroxychloroquine, and that's a treatment, a common treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. So there are protocols to know what safe dosing is. it's not the therapeutic index of the drug are not such that it's poison at low doses. They're relatively safe at low doses. And yet I was hearing from people in the medical school who were telling me that it causes heart problems at high rates. And I thought to myself, this doesn't not consistent with my previous understanding of the drug. Like, are there not therapeutic doses that we understand such that we can avoid these side effects? If there weren't, then why are they recommending rheumatoid arthritis patients take it? Why are they recommending healthy people take it just because they're going to places where malaria is endemic? It made no sense to me. Like, it was really, really clearly a poison debate over a drug that was very, very, very cheap. And then I started hearing about other drugs like fluvoxamine. And I know I'm getting the timeline wrong because 2020 was a blurry year. But like when you spoke in the Senate on ivermectin and you talked about what happened, the experience in South America, if I remember right, with ivermectin, and you said, look, this is a drug that works. We have a way to make it so that people don't go into the thing. I was very struck, and a couple of thoughts. Like, probably you can understand one thought I had, which is, well, gosh, we really should have run a randomized trial. Let's get active. Let's get Active 6 to run it very, very quickly. We will know the answer immediately. And then second, like, this is really promising. We should really look at this. What were you thinking going into that testimony, and what was the reaction you got to that testimony?
Jay, I have to say, at that time, my naivete still had no bounds. I didn't really, because I'm just going to get to the heart of it now, Jay. I'm sorry, but the scope and scale of the corruption and fraud and these disinformation campaigns against early repurposed, FDA-approved, cheap, safe drugs, I didn't know that war was going on. Paul and I have to admit, we got fooled by the hydroxychloroquine disinformation campaign. Like, because we started seeing these, randomized controlled trials appearing in these top journals and all showing that there
was a scandal, right?
Some were easily proven.
It wasn't randomized, but the Lancet and the New England Journal published studies based on literally a fraudulent database called the Surgisphere database, where they showed that, and it was funny for me because I analyzed for a living before the pandemic. I analyzed existing hospital and insurance claims data to answer clinical questions. I had never heard of this database before. So when I saw the studies, I thought to myself, what is this? What is this data? I was like, okay, maybe I've missed something in my career beforehand. I've used the Medicare claims data. I've used Blues. I've used all kinds of other claims databases, but I'd never heard of this one database. And all of a sudden, it's this international database from like N countries, vast numbers of people, and it finds that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. I just thought this is very strange. And then a week later, it turns out they're fraudulent. The database is fraudulent. The set of people that were they convinced some like top people at Harvard to sign on to it. It was stunning.
But the retraction gets much less attention than the publication. By that time, when it got retracted for like what was easily proven fraudulent to people like yourself, like researchers, they could see this. The data didn't make sense, and like you said, what is this database? I wasn't paying attention to hydroxychloroquine. I got to tell you, I never paid attention to hydroxychloroquine until much, much later. And we were of the mind that it didn't work because we'd seen some of the trials and some of the randomized.
I'm willing to agree that it doesn't. I mean, again, the time I didn't know yes or no, but at the time now, ex post, it probably doesn't. We'll talk about ivermectin in a second, where I think the answer is much more complicated. But hydroxychloroquine, it's an example of something where it's promising, but the set of dosing you have to do and the timing of it is probably not. It's just finicky, so it's not as like in 2020. It probably didn't work. I don't know. I don't know for certain, but that's my opinion.
Well, no, I would say in 2020, if you just looked at the high impact medical journal randomized controlled trials, it appeared that it didn't work. But those were actually proven fraudulent. They pulled a lot of hijinks. The solidarity trials by the WHO was actually a crime, I believe. They used toxic, lethal doses that have never been described for any disease before. They were using doses that you've never heard of. And the patients who got treated with hydroxychloroquine died at higher rates than the others. And I mean, if you haven't seen the Epidemic of Fraud, it's a documentary came out, I think recently. They go real deep into the hydroxychloroquine story, and it is a very troubling story. But at the time, Paul and I didn't know how captured the journals
By the
were.
way,
I mean, I
Pierre,
used to venerate the top journals.
you're saying that you're
and they
naive.
were putting
I
out
claim the
trials.
same thing. Like at that point, I was still thinking that I was still doing normal science in a world of normal science. And at this point, I can look back and say, gosh, there was a lot of distortions, some of which you've already talked about. But
Yeah, you were doing normal science. Let me say one more thing, Jay. The other thing that you just said, which I think is so important, which is that's part of that disinformation, right? They suddenly characterize a drug that's been around for decades, used in all sorts of situations, as dangerous, right? So suddenly it's dangerous. That's one thing they did to try to do say in ivermectin. But you also talked about something which was just like a precautionary principle. Let's say hydroxychloroquine didn't work, or we didn't know if it worked or didn't work. It's so safe and worked for so long. You would have taken it for prevention of malaria. Why not just let everyone take it until we can figure it out? Like just on that's just simple logical rationale in an uncharted scene. But anyway,
so let's ask you about the Senate.
Because I think
let me set the stage for ivermectin. So then maybe you could set the stage better than me. But ivermectin is a drug. It's a miracle drug, right? It's developed. And it's used around the world in literally billions of patients. It cures river blindness. It's probably the most important drug for the treatment of blindness in the history of all mankind. It's used for parasitic diseases. It's a mainstay of treating a huge number of diseases that involve sort of an excessive inflammatory response in response to a pathogen, often a parasite. I had not considered it as a drug for COVID, but there were people like you and others who were saying, "Look, this might work." And then you come to the Senate and you point to evidence from South America where they're using it at scale and having some success. So what led you to that point, and what response did you get?
Well, what happened was Paul was keeping like this. I remember it was this really cool table of potential therapeutics for COVID. And we were following all the clinical data that was coming out. And he had stuff like, yes, use, don't. He had it like green, yellow, and red. So we had this, and it was kind of a real-time table of stuff we were following. And ivermectin was off the table with a question mark, because we'd heard rumors that people were using it to some effect, but there was really no data. And then in October of 2020, so a couple of months before my testimony, suddenly, like 3 trials came out on preprint, and they were just eye-popping. And then we found a case series from the Dominican Republic that was published in June. And Paul basically gave a presentation to all of us on a Zoom one day. And he says, I think this thing can end the pandemic. And he said that based on, I think, maybe 4 or 5 studies from a few different, but one of them was published in Chest. And it came out of Broward County. Remember J.J. Ryder? He also testified in that. That was the ivermectin. He testified just before me. But he had done a retrospective observational propensity score match trial, right? So they really matched the patients very well. And he showed that in the sickest patient in the hospital, there was a 70% reduction in mortality. He had a lot of difficulty publishing it, but he published it in October in the journal Chest, which is one of the top journals in my specialty. And so with that really robust one, with these other ones in preprints and these case series, Paul said, I think this is going to do it. And then we started looking for data. And I don't know if you know what Trial Site News is. Trial Site News, they did a great job putting out real-time ivermectin studies and data of places that it was being used. And over the next 2 months, up until my testimony, the data just kept going up and up. So I was writing this review paper, and it was almost impossible to publish because every time I was like near finishing my draft, a new trial would pop up on a preprint. And so the amount of evidence was growing. But let me just also interject by saying, I published that paper on a preprint server early November of 2021, month before my testimony. And a woman reached out to us 2 weeks later with a $1,500 donation. We had like no donations. It was kind of all riding on my credit card at that time. I was paying for the website. And then she wrote an email of thanks, and I was so interested that I called her. So I had never treated someone with ivermectin at this point. So I called her, and she was like the CEO of a medical staffing company. And she told me the following story is that she was sick for 2 weeks with COVID. She had persistent fevers after 2 weeks, a resting heart rate of like 120. She felt really sick. And I guess she was following stuff. She was following us. She read my preprint paper. She showed it to her pulmonologist, and the pulmonologist like, all right, seems like there's some evidence, and treated her with ivermectin. She took a pill on Sunday night. And by the way, this is actually in the official Senate record because she submitted her story to Senator Johnson. She took a pill on a Sunday night. She felt really flushed within an hour, went to sleep. Next morning, no fever, heart rate of 80. She felt like her chest was clear. And it was like this dramatic clinical response. So that was the first patient I was sort of involved in treating, and then I started treating patients. And the first year especially, it wasn't always like this with ivermectin. There were also variants and times where like I had to use multiple drugs, but that first year, like I was getting away with just ivermectin. I'd give someone ivermectin and literally they were all telling me within 12 to 24 hours that they were feeling much better. And so you had all this trials evidence, my own. I was talking to doctors in South America. I was meeting people and people reaching out to me from all over the world, giving me their clinical experience, even India. And so for me, it was just became a mainstay. And then I gave that testimony, and I thought there was, here's the other thing, Jay. Let's talk a little more like academics. So with guidelines, right? There's grade 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C, right? So in NIH grading categories, 1A is like large prospective double-blind randomized control trials, right? And so if you have a 1A recommendation, that's the highest strength of recommendation. But you can also have 2A, 2B, 2C. And like a 2B, we had more than enough evidence for a 2B recommendation. And after that testimony, we were invited to present to the NIH Treatment Guidelines Committee, and we buried them with all of the trials. And we brought the guy from the WHO. He had 11 randomized controlled trials with over 1,400 patients, the meta-analyses of which all showed these dramatic reductions. I mean, 11 randomized controlled trials. Yes, they're not like huge pharma, double-blind randomized. They all had little warts on them.
So, I mean, I was struck by that too. That there's, and I talked with this woman in the UK who organized it. Maybe it was that trial, that meta-analysis. This named Tess Laurie, who was doing a meta-analysis. She's fantastic.
Yeah, she's my friend.
She has a long career doing meta-analyses, and she concluded, based on the meta-analysis, I think in January 2021 or December 2020, that there was enough good randomized evidence for ivermectin working if given early in the course of clinical disease at certain doses, that it prevented you from getting hospitalized or dying. Right. So that's her conclusion. I was struck because there was also a competing meta-analysis led by a man named Andrew Hill, who was more closely connected to the pharmaceutical companies. And he looked at the same evidence. Apparently he was working at some point with Tess Laurie, but broke away, and had a competing meta-analysis that said it doesn't work based on the same data. And I looked, and I couldn't understand.
Well, hold on, Jay. I have to correct you. It's not that his meta-analysis says it didn't work. He actually found similar results. It's how he wrote up the meta-analysis.
Well, that was what I was going to say, striking, because I was looking at.
I don't know if you're going to talk about.
I couldn't understand his conclusion from what he wrote in the because he was looking at the same data sets.
Exactly.
There's an absolutely remarkable video of Tess Laurie speaking with Andrew Hill, and Hill looks incredibly uncomfortable. She's asking him, "Why are you doing this? Why are you putting this conclusion? You should change the conclusion." And he has no defense. He just looks uncomfortable, and he makes these sort of like dark claims about the people that are funding me don't want me to say it this way. Effectively, is what he says. And the question is, who are these people? What are they? Why are you changing the result on the basis of what your people, the funders, are telling you to do? Why don't you just report the results that are in front of you? So
I was friendly with Andrew and collegial with Andrew for several months. In fact, if you look at the time of that video, that was second week of January 2021. Tess knew the fix was in. She knew that Andrew was being influenced by his funders. And she had invited him to work with him, but if you remember, she was thundering at him. How can you do this? There are thousands and thousands of people dying every day, and you're writing up your work like this. You know what the data shows. How can you do this? And he looks very uncomfortable. He even admits that his sponsors are influencing how he writes up the results. And, I stayed collegial with him. And Tess really didn't understand that. I think of it now as good cop, bad cop, because he was also helping me know what trials were coming out, what some of the real-time data was. And so I worked with him, but let's be clear with who he was working for. So his position was, he's a professor at the University of Liverpool. And I first met him at a virtual conference a week after my testimony, because I was invited to present a lecture for this French biotech company that was formulating a long-acting injectable ivermectin. And it was a 3-day conference. I gave the first lecture, and Andrew presented on like the third day. I didn't see him, but Paul Marik was watching. And Paul calls me and he says, there's a guy from the WHO working on ivermectin. He's got a meta-analysis of ivermectin trials. And I looked at the talk, and he knew of trials that I didn't know of. And I was like, wow, he's got really good data. So I reached out to him, and we started talking. And I remember asking him, I said, so this is what he did. So he worked for Unitaid. So Unitaid is an international healthcare organization, and they were part of the ACT Accelerator program, which was the WHO's like 3-part research on diagnostics, therapeutics, and prevention. So he was assigned in June of 2020 to look at repurposed drugs. And he had looked at hydroxychloroquine, a bunch of others, and he determined none of them were effective. And then he told me that in early November of 2020, right around the time that I posted my preprint, a professor at his university told him to look into ivermectin. And so he started compiling, and his job was to scour all of the world's clinical trials databases, clinicaltrials.gov, look for any registered randomized controlled trial on ivermectin, and contact the researchers. So he had a long list. He had 59 active randomized controlled trials. He was in contact with all those researchers. And so he was really interesting to talk to, and he was super enthusiastic. You have to understand, he knew this stuff worked, and the data just kept coming and coming and coming. But I continued to work with him after that test call. In fact, Paul and I peer reviewed that paper, and we said, Andrew, this sounds like scientific misconduct. You need to correct all of these things that you put in there, because it was a crazy written paper with all these cautions and questions, and it's like self-doubting. By the way, Jay, when a researcher writes a paper where they found something that's potentially effective, their tendency
that was the mystery.
Overstate the importance of the results. And
like you had like people that were assigned to do these randomized trials on these cheap repurposed drugs, and it almost seemed like they wanted to find a negative result, which is so far outside of my experience with researchers. Researchers normally make their careers on positive results. Like that's a classic source of bias in the literature, is that you only publish the positive results, not the negative ones. And yet you had people that were exulting in negative results. It's a very odd thing, especially given that there was this competing meta-analysis.
Because it's not a profitable drug. And I think there's a lot of incentives on those researchers to and like I talk about in my book, that is a classic tactic, disinformation tactic that industries deploy when science emerges that's inconvenient to their results. And the tactic is called the fix, where they conduct trials with predetermined results. And there's so many examples of that with ivermectin. There's numerous examples of that hydroxychloroquine. And speaking to your bias, it's those trials which were selectively published in the journals. And that was probably the greatest exposure and realization from pre-COVID Pierre to now.
Meta-analysis done by Tess Lowry and her group that concludes appropriately, I thought. That there's good evidence that it might work. Right, at least in 2020. I actually spoke with Tess a little bit after that, and I think her sense was that the increasing number of people who'd already had COVID and recovered. It made the vaccine less effective, because if you already had COVID and recovered, there's no purpose in the vaccine really, and it also made ivermectin less necessary, because you're not going to on a reinfection, you're less likely to be hospitalized, less likely to get a severe reaction the second time you get COVID than the first, even without treatment.
Yes, it depends on when you talk to her, because then Delta came around. Delta was really rough. Ivermectin wasn't cutting it alone.
I forget exactly. September, October 2021 is when I talked with her. But yeah, right around a little after that, maybe. Kind of like the timelines. I need to go back and look at my notes for when they were. I think they are kind of important. But yeah, but the sense was that by late 2021, the time had already passed, right? That we'd missed our window. If we'd only done the work earlier and just like it had been done with dexamethasone or whatever, and really honestly looked at the data, maybe we could have landed on ivermectin. And now I'm seeing randomized trials done saying that metformin works. which is such a, another cheap drug, but 4 years too late.
Yeah.
Right. If we'd known metformin worked in 2020, we could have defused the pandemic. Fluvoxamine also, I've seen some evidence. I mean, all these cheap repurposed, it seems like this is a disease that if you can somehow undercut the excessive inflammatory reaction that comes from it, that you can avoid much of the harm of it, at least the version of it that floated around in 2020.
For sure. I mean, here's the other thing, not to go backwards, Jay, but, when I gave that testimony, after Paul said that in that Zoom that day, and I started looking at the trials that he had found, I was like, let's write a review paper of this. And the first thing I did is I started looking into ivermectin literature, and I was shocked to find that starting in 2012, there was numerous in vitro studies of ivermectin stopping replication of like almost a dozen RNA viruses. There was really good basic science in vitro support, like Zika, West Nile, dengue, polio, even influenza. So it had this history of it had a growing evidence base that it was a potent antiviral. So it's anti-parasitic, anti-inflammatory, antiviral. It's also anti-tumor. We're now getting much more clinical experiences with tumor. So you're right. It is this wonder drug, which is what Satoshi Amura called it. But Amura knew that. He knew that it had a lot of antiviral properties, and he reached out to Merck and said, we need to study this. And he asked them for funds. I mean, he literally won the Nobel Prize with a Merck researcher. And when he reached out to Merck in 2020,
a couple of days ago, I think I just saw that he published a meta-analysis. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Nomura, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for ivermectin, just published a meta-analysis of ivermectin, which seems like it worked. I mean, it's funny. It's like I spent a lot of the pandemic uncertain. I mean, because I'm primarily a scholar, right? So I have a standard of evidence when I think as a scholar. I'm also a policy person. I have a different way of thinking. You may not accept as a scholar that we have sufficient evidence, high quality randomized evidence, but as a policy analyst, I have to say, look, we have to work on incomplete evidence we have. We have to make decisions on the incomplete evidence we have. So there's kind of like two standards in my own mind about how to think and talk about these things. I think that.
Jay, there's a third skill that you probably are starting to develop that you needed that I had none of, which now I have a lot of, which is not only that scholar and policy part, but is understanding, recognizing, and identifying the corrupt influence of the pharmaceutical industry in that research. That's what I saw the mistake. That's, in my opinion, what I saw all of these huge academics around the country where they had these strong opinions that ivermectin data, the narratives were so repetitive, small, uncontrolled, low quality studies, and all the usual EBM complaints, and ignoring these massive meta-analyses. And then the common refrain in all of the newspaper articles, some pedigreed professor would come out and say, the large, high quality, rigorous trials show that it definitively doesn't work. And I'd be in my office, my brain's popping out of my ear, because I'm like, the ones that you're saying are high quality are run by corrupt investigators that are literally working for pharma on the side, and they're pulling all of these tricks. I mean, you read my book. I called the one chapter called The Big Six, and they pulled the same things. I mean, they did brazen stuff, Jay. Like, for instance, they put in weight limits on ivermectin. So, like, if you were above 85 kilograms, you got the 85 kilogram dose. That's never been described in the history of using ivermectin. There's no such thing as a weight. It distributes to adipose tissue. The bigger you are, the more you need. And then they were underdosing the obese. They always put the mildest in, lowest doses, shortest durations. I mean, 3 days for an antiviral has never been used. We've never used an antiviral for 3 days. And those were the high quality, rigorous trials. And then there's shenanigans behind the scenes. They're changing endpoints. Their data's not matching up. They're hiding stuff from their published papers. I mean, me and a couple others, we did you had to do these insane deep dives where you had to look at protocol versions. There's protocol version 1 to 8, and the little changes that they were making, they were tweaking the knobs and dials, Jay, to make it so that ivermectin didn't work. And it was
this is part of the reason why I've been reluctant to wade in on this, because I think it really does require a deep dive on the exact protocols followed in order for me to make an informed thing. But of course, when you expect people doing honest meta-analysis to have done that deep dive, and I think someone like Tess Lowry did that deep dive. So did Andrew Hill. And it was just unfortunate that that as a result of, I think really it's pharma interference, that the water got muddied over something that should have been clear.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to mention about Andrew Hill, so he works for Unitaid, which is, funding from lots of big countries. I think France, I think Korea. It gets funding from Bill and Melinda Gates, but the Accelerator program, which is this collaboration between the WHO and Unitaid, was fully staffed and run by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I mean, they show up everywhere.
Okay. I don't want to get into motives because I don't know.
It's,
I don't know these guys, but I do think it was such an odd kind of, because I read both of those meta-analyses very carefully, and I could not understand Hill's conclusions relative to Lowry's. That just did not make sense to me. Okay, so let me. I promised you an hour, 100%. Or an hour 15, but there's still one more topic I really wanted to get to, and I want to make sure that readers hear about this. Okay, so you and Paul Marik and others who were involved with the FLCCC have faced vicious smears. In your book, you write about how you lost 3 jobs. Marik, in particular, as you said, he'd done some very famous work and became famous in ICU circles, CCU circles, critical care circles, as changing fundamental protocols of how patients are managed in critical care. Some of his old work came under some very unfair criticism. Particularly the vitamin C papers I think you mentioned were attacked by statisticians who claimed that he'd done fraudulent work with them, like he'd somehow fudged the numbers. And of course, it came out ex post that the accusations of fraud were themselves fraudulent. That in fact that there was not statistical evidence of him committing any sort of fraud. And I was looking at that, just feeling my heart just went out to him. Like, he's a man who has made his career as an honest scholar, and now all of a sudden, because he is on the margin on this issue, all of the rest of his work is now going to be attacked in very unfair ways. That kind of smearing was pretty common for anyone who spoke up during the pandemic, and in particular. But
yeah, let me say something. So I'm going back to the Disinformation playbook, right? So that's kind of the theme or structure of my book, is I really detail using that playbook as the conceptual underpinnings of how they conducted this war on ivermectin. And one of the tactics, and I invite your viewers, if they haven't read it yet, just Google Disinformation Playbooks. It's a very short article. It's on the website of the Union for Concerned Scientists. And one of the tactics, it's 5 tactics, they're named after football players, but one is called the Blitz. And the Blitz is when they go after researchers producing inconvenient science. And so one of the examples they use in that article is the Will Smith movie about Bennett Omalu, the guy who first discovered chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right? That the retired football players were getting with the microhemorrhages, and they were getting early dementia and headaches and psychoses and even committing suicide. And they went after Omalu. They tried to destroy him, because he was actually producing data that football might be bad for your brain, right? And let's put that in context. Football, NFL, is a $9 billion industry. The pharmaceutical industry is a $1 trillion industry, and they know how to blitz, boy. And they use third-party front groups. They use these statisticians on social media. They went after us everywhere. But here's the important thing about what you brought up, Jay, is that I think Paul and I pretty quickly got used to the hit jobs, the mischaracterizations that we were grifters, that we didn't know ivermectin science, and we don't know how to read the literature, and that we were causing harm. And I kind of got used to that because there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, if someone doesn't understand how deeply studied I am and they want to characterize myself as ignorant, fine. But that vitamin C thing, I got to tell you, that was a very emotional thing. I thought Paul and I were used to it. But then when they went out to Paul for what was really a landmark study, which, by the way, I think I'm going to write a book next, which is called The War on IV Vitamin C, because it's actually very similar, because I want to show how they destroyed IV vitamin C. But Paul's research on IV vitamin C is so profound, so potent, and they started calling that fraudulent. And the journal and his hospital was going after him because he caused a lot of problems for his hospital publicly, because he sued them when they wouldn't let him use his medicines for COVID. But the day that he received the letter, and I hope he doesn't mind us sharing this, the day he received the letter from Chest absolving him of any fraud or ethical concerns, he was crying, Jay. He was crying because he felt like if they were able to ever show that he committed fraud in that trial, his entire career's
Well, that's the
work
thing. It's like he's
would have
he's an
been kind of dismissed. And I
he's an
didn't realize
honest
how
man and a
important
scholar,
that was
right?
to
And
him.
so the accusation of fraud cuts deep, especially when it's not true. I mean, I faced the same thing with an early study I did on how quickly COVID had spread. There was accusations of my having changed the result based on $5,000 that a JetBlue founder had given to Stanford for the study, right? Not to me. I mean, it was. I have to say, like, it is ridiculous. It was ridiculous, but it was such an unfair smear designed to cut at my integrity, which was really the main thing I have in my career. Like, if I don't have that, I mean, I could be wrong on. I mean, we're all wrong on things from time to time. That's just the nature of doing science. But the issue is not that. The issue is, like, can you trust me as a researcher? That's what was the attack on Paul, and it was so deeply unfair, based on a very, very naive statistical analysis. And it was evident that the attack was done in bad faith because it was only because Paul was at the front line of the COVID treatment that was on the outside of what the central authorities wanted to say, that he was being attacked. That because he was on the fringe. That's why he was attacked.
But yeah, I think it's also, there's another layer that I think we need to understand, another prism in which we should understand what they're doing. By doing that, right, by attacking his credibility, it's literally a form of censorship, right? So propagandists, disinformationists, their greatest enemy is the truth and truth tellers. And in order to fight the truth tellers, all you have to do is make them appear as uncredible, untrustworthy. Their voices are gone. So if they could show that Paul's a fraud over here, how can you believe what he says about COVID and ivermectin and all this other things? And so it's really it's a censoring tactic. And just, there's an article from 10 years ago how Merck, with the Vioxx scandal, they had hit lists they kept of doctors who were out there in public calling concerns around the dangers of Vioxx. I mean, they go after doctors that threaten their products. And Paul is
one of the key doctors on that Vioxx scandal, the Merck sent somebody to go follow him. Like he almost got a nervous breakdown. Like everywhere he went, every talk he gave, there'd be some heckler in the audience from Merck. And in this pandemic, Pierre, they have it's not Merck this time. Now it's Moderna has essentially a hit list of doctors that they wanted to go after, and they recruited an army of tens of thousands of healthcare influencers to go after online and elsewhere. Anyone who questions yeah, I know, me too. Actually, I'm on that hit list. So it's striking. It's like you have an information environment where if you have a tremendous amount of money and power, like the pharmaceutical companies do, you can defame your critics without any consequence to you. And so there's no real independent check. And the FDA, which ought to serve as an independent check, didn't serve as an independent check. So this is the last item on my agenda, and I promise I'll let you go. But and I wanted to end on a positive high note. The FDA at that one point during the pandemic put out a tweet that said that I got to get this right, Paul. I got to get this right, Pierre. Okay.
I'll do it for you. You're not a horse. You're not a cow. Stop it, you
because
all.
Ivermectin is a very important veterinary drug in addition to being a very important human drug. And I mean, it's a funny tweet, right? It's funny. But it's also deeply unfair because what it's doing is it's trying to poison the well about the use of ivermectin by humans. And it had some consequences. So for one thing, a lot of people had heard about ivermectin by this time, and when they got COVID, they wanted to take it. And I looked this up. There are like a bunch of toxicology reports of people misdosing ivermectin because they self-dosed it as a result of not being able to get it from their doctor. A drug that's cheap, safe, and off-label. They couldn't get a prescription from their doctor. Doctors, in fact, who prescribed ivermectin, often many of them their licenses got threatened for the act of prescribing ivermectin. It became a dangerous act of rebellion for a doctor. There was kind of like an underground railroad almost for how to get ivermectin. And it's funny to talk about it that way, but I think that's exactly what happened. And the FDA essentially played a pretty fundamental role in that. For the FDA, which is not supposed to do that, right? It's not supposed to advise doctors how to practice medicine. What was your view on the FDA? And then I also want you to tell about the great success that you all have had in getting the FDA in court to remove that tweet and admit that they are not licensed to practice medicine.
Yeah, so when that tweet came out, I was, by that time, that's 7 months after, it was August of 2021. That's 7-8 months after my testimony on ivermectin in the Senate. By that time, those 8 months, I was fully educated into what was going on. I knew we were under massive federal regulatory capture of agencies. I knew they were complicit and serving the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. But when that started happening, it was only later in hindsight that I put it all together, because I want to tell you what that tweet was part of. It's not just the tweet. The tweet occurred 1 week after a report came out showing, like you said, ivermectin prescriptions were skyrocketing. So 90,000 a week on retail. And I think that's what spooked them into doing the following. Number one, August 21st, FDA tweet goes out. It starts to go viral. August 26th, the CDC sends a memo to every state board of medicine. It goes out to every licensed physician in the country. And it literally talks about rises in calls to poison control centers around ivermectin. So it's painting, just like hydroxychloroquine, painting ivermectin somehow as a dangerous drug. It's later found out by two investigative journalists that they completely overstated the calls. They said 70% rise in calls to poison. It was like 4 calls.
So like that one, it cuts both ways. The reason why there's overdosing is because the FDA is saying you're not allowed to prescribe it, and then a lot of people still want it. And they self-prescribe, right? Why are people going and getting veterinary versions of it? It's because the FDA says you can't go get the human version of it.
Yep. Yeah. So the CDC, first of all, the CDC is inflating it and mischaracterizing it as sudden epidemic of dangerous overdoses, which is completely misstated. But you're right. Those calls to poison control centers, people need guidance because they don't have doctors, because the FDA is like scaring the doctors away from doing it. But it's a tightly sequenced series of events. So you have 3 agencies who have made actions against ivermectin in a 10-day period. 21st, FDA. 26th, CDC. 29th, Tony Fauci of the NIAID goes out on national television on CNN with Jay Tapper and says, don't do it. There's no evidence this works. I got to tell you, Jay, I look back on the Wayback Machine on that C19 early database. There were 63 controlled trials on the day he said that, and I think it was something like 32 of them were randomized. And he goes out there and says there's no clinical – there was tens and tens of thousands of patients in lots of controlled trials. So you have this coordinated sequence. And then after those 3 actions by the agencies, you have 3 weeks of every late-night talk show host, daytime broadcaster, newspaper, horse dewormer. Jay, it was a propaganda campaign started by the FDA, followed by the other agencies. And in the wake of that campaign, formularies of hospitals, you couldn't get ivermectin. I was in a hospital where they literally took off the formulary while I was there. And I think I did read a chapter about what that was. I literally presented at a committee meeting, a P&T, Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, all of the evidence for ivermectin. The pharmacist who hated me and hated ivermectin because he believed all the agencies, we both presented our data. And the committee at the end, I said, someone asked, do you have any questions for Dr. Kory? And only one person asked the question. The person on the P&T committee asked me, Dr. Kory, you have all of this data showing that ivermectin is supposedly effective. Why is your opinion of that data so different than all of these agencies? And I just said very simply, I said, there's one difference: conflict of interest. I have no conflict of interest with ivermectin. 2 days later, the CMO tells me that they removed it from the formulary.
Well, you did. I mean, the happy end of that story, if there is one, is that a federal judge, I think, has told the FDA that they're not allowed to practice medicine. Mary Bowden and others have this, I think, an enormous victory in this. Paul Marik. I mean, so and in a way, with the FDA has been rebuked, but really 2 years too late after having, or more than 2 years too late.
2 years too late. And they decided to settle. So the big story, we'll finish here, is, a few months ago, they came and offered a settlement to the 3 plaintiffs, Mary Talley Bowden, Robert Apter, and Paul Marik. And they have to now take down, because they exceeded their statutory authority, they took illegal actions. And by the way, one more little factoid. Jay, when they put out that tweet and they had a page on their website, and they were literally denigrating and kind of warning against ivermectin. There was a statement on that day that said, "We have not reviewed the evidence for ivermectin, but it hasn't been authorized or approved." So it's just crazy. Anyway, but now they had to settle. So they've had to take down every social media post, their tweet. They had to change their page, and they got busted for. I think what the entire U.S. population should ask is, why did they do this? There's no reason why they should have done it. They've never done it before. Why did they do it in this instance? And so that's the question that they can only answer. And I know the answer,
at
but
the very least,
I think people should start by asking
that
question.
They never do it again. Okay, Pierre. So I've kept you way too long, but I'm really grateful because I've wanted to talk to you for so long, and your answers have lived up to my expectations. I'm really grateful to you for the work that you've done during the pandemic, and for coming on this podcast and talking with me. What's next for you? What are the next steps? I mean, I know you lost 3 jobs, but is the future looking bright for you?
I have a practice that I'm really interested in. I actually have some thoughts on things I want to work on in the future. I don't want to talk about them now, but I got things that I want to work on. Like you said, we need solutions. We need to make some changes so that they don't do this stuff again. And I think I want to work towards that and trying to help to that. And we'll see. We're up against a behemoth. The forces that we're up against are so powerful, Jay. But
we can take.
I don't know.
Giants,
I don't back down from fights.
So thank you for everything very much. So this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya talking to Dr. Pierre Kory on the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Until next time, thank you for listening.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.